Yeah, you can stand up.
All right. So the same figure that's in the garden, and then the one that tempts Jesus in the wilderness, how does that potentially fit into the sort of spiritual hierarchy that we see amongst like the ones that have dominion over the various nations and whatnot?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's yeah, I'm on. That's wonderful. We would start out with such a simple question. Again, since I don't have my laptop, I'm trying to think of the quick way to illustrate something I'm going to say here. So let's try this. Okay, that's sort of okay. Yeah, I could actually show you this better in English if I had my own laptop here, but I'll try to mention it. So, if you think back to the three rebellions idea, each of the rebellions has a cost. Okay, in some cases more than one. And with respect to the first one, we have the figure in the garden, the supernatural rebel, who will become known eventually as Satan and the devil, and a bunch of other titles as well. That because of his rebellion, we have death. We didn't have death before, so Eden is no more. Eden is ruined. We don't have everlasting life with God anymore, so we have estrangement from God and death. Now, because of that, in the Hebrew Bible, you do not have this figure referred to specifically as it relates to the events of Genesis 3. But what you do have is you have in so many places both the evidence of the outcome of his rebellion, and also you have anti-Eden. What I mean by that is opposite Eden imaging to remind people of the ruination of Eden. That's kind of a convoluted way to start here, but I mention that for a specific reason. It's a fact that in Genesis 3 we have the serpent. Okay, the serpent is never called Satan in Genesis 3. The serpent is actually never called Satan anywhere in the Hebrew Bible. The serpent is only called Satan in the book of Revelation, which is the last book of the New Testament. So, critics, critical scholars, again, those who either don't have any theological sensitivity or, frankly, just love to destroy people's faith. I mean, they're not necessarily the same person there. They love to point this out and say things like, the Bible doesn't really know of a figure called Satan until the last book, and there's no relationship here to Genesis 3, and a lot of this Satan stuff is made up, and blah, 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 blah. They try to create contradictions between the two testaments. And I reject that, not surprisingly, acknowledging that we don't have a devil figure that goes by the term Satan, the title Satan, in the Old Testament. I'm well aware of that. You might think, well, what about Job 1 and 2? Okay. In Job 1 and 2, you have the Hebrew noun Satan. Hebrew is like English. English does not tolerate the definite article, the word the, in front of a proper personal name. The language doesn't include that in its rules, and neither does English. So I'm not the Mike. My wife is not the Darina. It sounds stupid. I say the exception to this is Donald Trump. He gets to be the Donald, okay? But his wife called him the Donald, But ordinarily this is not what you see going on. So if the definite article in Job 1 and 2 precedes the word Satan, that tells you it's not a proper personal name. And in every instance, here's my terrible visual here. It would look so much better in my own software. But now those are the ones that have the article. So let me just give you one example. Let's go to Job chapter 1, verse 6. In all the instances where you have Satan show up in the Hebrew Bible, that's for comparison so you can see it in the Hebrew word order. Okay, we've got Hebrew interlinear. Contents unavailable for some reason, I don't know why. Let's go to LHB. We know that's in here. Open Lexham Hebrew Bible. So, Job 1:6. We have here the sons of God, the B'nai Ha-Elohim, stood before the Lord. And there came also among them you look at the lower left-hand corner. It has article, the. It's a definite article. Appended to the noun Satan. Every occurrence of Satan in Job 1 and 2, Zechariah 3, has the definite article. That means this is not Satan proper name. It means it should be translated, ESV has a note here, the accuser, or the adversary, or the opponent, or the challenger. I mean, there's any number of ways you could render this. And in Job 1 and 2, what's going on, this is not the devil. This is not, again, the villain of Genesis 3. This is a member of the heavenly court who's actually doing his job in Job chapter 1. Because they have this meeting, divine council meeting, and this figure comes in, and God asks, the Lord said to Hasatan, to the adversary or the accuser, hey, where'd you come from? And the accuser answered the Lord and said, from going to and fro on the earth and from walking up and down on it. Now we know from this language elsewhere that basically his job, and this is actually part of a wider subject, a wider motif, that if you can Google this, Google nakedbiblepodcast.com, put in heavenly books or book of life. This is part of a bigger complex of ideas where members of the heavenly host watch people and record what they do and what happens to them. We're used to the book of life, but there's actually half a dozen different books, heavenly books, mentioned in the Bible. Just the book of life gets all the press because everybody reads the book of Revelation. Okay. So this is actually one of these agents that looks throughout the earth to see who is obeying God and who is not. And the reason he does that isn't because God has Alzheimer's. Okay. It's not that God has a bad memory. It's so that on the day of judgment, you have no complaint, dude. We have a complete record of your life. Okay, we know if you've embraced the Messiah or not. We know everything about you. It's a matter of record. It's a very ancient idea that you find in other cultures in the Hebrew Bible. So the Satan, the accuser, is the one that when he sees someone out of step or out of line, he reports. This is what he's doing in Job 1. And specifically in the context, God's like, hey, have you checked out Job? That guy's awesome. He's blameless. And what does the Satan, the adversary, say? Yeah, I've seen him. And here's where he crosses the line. Here's where he moves from reporting to essentially challenging God's own integrity. He says, yeah, I've seen Job, but if you took away all he had, if you allowed him to be harmed, he would curse you to your face. So it's a challenge. Now God could, and I love to reference the movie Time Bandits here, but it doesn't usually work because it dates me and a lot of people haven't seen the movie, but it's one of these British comedies. John Cleese is in it. That's probably all you need to know from Monty Python. But part of the backdrop to this story is it's this cosmic good and evil thing going on. And the bad guy is the Satan figure, okay? And he's called the evil one. And of course he has henchmen working for him that are complete idiots. So they have a council meeting in the movie. And the evil one has been holed up in this fortress by the creator. And he can't get out. But he thinks that he thinks he's awesome. Just the big ego. And he starts going on about how great he is and how powerful he is. And then one of his henchmen says, well, if that's the case, why haven't you been able to escape from this fortress? And the evil one says, what did you say? I said, why haven't you been able to escape from this? And he just reaches out and blows him to bits. And you get a good laugh at it because it's one of these comedies. So God could do that, could he not? He could tell the adversary, what did you say? You're challenging my omniscience and the accuracy of my assessment of Job. He could just blow him up and say, don't ever talk to me like that again. That's the line in the movie. After he blows him up, don't ever talk to me like that again. But if he does that, guess what? The question is still on the table. The question is unanswered. So everybody else in the divine council, if he blows the adversary to bits, they're wondering, okay, the adversary's gone now, but God never really answered the question. God never really did anything to inform us otherwise. Maybe the Satan was right about Job, and God isn't. So God doesn't blow up the adversary. What he does is he says, okay, you're allowed to do anything you want to Job. Except you're not allowed to take his life, because I don't want, I'm reading between the lines here, but if he allows Job to die, if he allows the Satan, the adversary, to take his life, then God already knows what's going to happen. He's going to come back and say, oh yeah, Job would have buckled if he would have survived, but I just accidentally killed him. So, I still think that Job would curse you. No, we're not doing that. You are not allowed to take his life. You can do anything else you want. And we'll see who's right. The court will see, the council will see who's correct. Now, none of that, and that's the way the book plays out. You as the reader, you know the backdrop of Job, the first 2 chapters. Job doesn't know any of this is going on. So the book is about why the righteous suffer. And sometimes the answer is, you're never going to know. But you have to trust God, that it's happening for a reason. The reason may not be made known to you, it may be. I mean, at the end of the book of Job, what Job loses is restored and all that sort of thing. I mean, we know the story. But none of that has anything to do with Genesis 3. Now, if you go into Second Temple Judaism, though, and by the time you get to the New Testament, the original rebel is perceived as the arch ruler of everything. He's the god of this world, to quote Paul in 2 Corinthians 4. He's the ruler of the prince of the power of the air, and all these titles, these lofty titles. So the question is, how does this guy get preeminence, and why? I go into a lot of the details here in the Demons book, but the short answer is, the reason he gets preeminence is really, there's a couple of reasons that emerge from, again, some of these other texts. These texts are useful even if they're not in the Bible because they tell you how readers of the Bible were processing these kinds of questions and what passages in the Hebrew Bible they were looking at to process the questions the way they did. So it's very useful. It's like reading a commentary in some sense. And so the answer that you get is he gets street cred from being the first. That's a big deal. He's the first one to have the quote-unquote courage to challenge God and oppose what God wants to do. But the real reason he gets preeminence is because all of the other ones know, the principalities and powers know that, we can do what we want here to these people. We can abuse them all day long. We can have them destroy themselves. But at the end of the day, everything dies. They all die. Which means they all go to the realm of the dead where this guy is king. Because in the garden story, the rebel is cast down to the ground. Okay, it's actually more than one of the texts. The term is eretz, which is the normal term for earth, but eretz is also one of the terms for the underworld. This is why we have an underworld. This is why we have a realm of the dead, because this one, through his rebellion and deceiving the humans and their rebellion, now we have death. We have a place that when people, now they're going to die for the first time, and they go to a place. They don't cease to exist in terms of their spirits, so they go to the new realm of the dead, and guess who runs the show there? It's this guy, because he's cast down not only to the eretz, to the underworld, but if you look at the curse, and I read the curse metaphorically of the serpent in the garden, he wanted to be in charge. He wants to be the one that makes the rules. He wants to oppose God's plan. He has a better idea. Well, in the curse, he is actually put beneath the hooves of the animals. He's not only cast down to the ground, he's like under them. So he wants to be at the highest level, now you're at the lowest level. So deal with it. This is your domain now. And yes, you are the God of this world because now everything dies. Everything is going to wind up at your house on your doorstep. And so the other ones know that at the end of the day, this one has ultimate authority because everything will die. And so that's why he emerges as the one who is perceived as causing the most harm and whose rebellion has the greatest reach. He therefore has the most authority over the world of men, over the world of humans, because now they all die. So that in a nutshell is the relationship of the Genesis 3 thing to the sort of cosmic hierarchy. But it actually doesn't have anything to do specifically with Job 1 and 2. Now let's go back there. This is sort of like the Elohim discussion. We have been taught, for some reason, again, it's just tradition, that somehow we get unnerved by the thought that we don't have the devil in Job 1 and 2 because we've always been taught that. And we get unnerved by the observation that's very simple to confirm. Just do your own, look it up yourself in your own Bible. The serpent is never called Satan. Okay? Well, that must mean there's a contradiction. No, you know what it means? It means that biblical writers are under no obligation to use the same words to describe the same guy. Where's the cosmic rule that says every time we talk about anti-Eden or the undoing of Eden or death that we have to use the word Satan or the word serpent? Who made up that rule? Why is it that we have to use the same vocabulary in all these passages? Is there a cosmic rule that says we can't come up with other terms to refer to the same rebel over the course of time that fit, that aptly describe him? This is actually what you see in the Second Temple period texts. The rebel of Eden, Genesis 3, the supernatural one, gets called a number of things in between the Testaments. He does get called Satan there. It starts to be used as a proper name. This is when we have the transition outside the Hebrew Bible. But then it takes the form of mastema. Again, I'm not going to bore you with Hebrew noun formation. I mean, that would put you out, okay? But you take, Satam, which is a related word to Satan, to oppose. When you want to make it a noun, you put an M in front of it. So we have mastema. Okay, that becomes a title in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's used. Belial, the worthless one. That's not an Old Testament term. We can't call the rebel of Genesis 3 Belial because there's a cosmic rule that says we can only use the word Satan. Really? Why? Again, there is no rule like that. So we have mastema, we have Belial. Beliar is a derivative. We have Beelzebul, which is actually a really interesting one. Beelzebul is Canaanite. Beel is Baal. Zebul is the word for prince. Okay, Baal becomes sort of a primary source figure for Satan imagery. Why? Because Baal is Lord of the dead in Canaanite religion. He also thinks he's the ruler of the nations. Prince Baal. I mean, the Gospels refer to the devil, to Satan, as Beelzebul. This is why. Okay? So you get a number of these things. Diabolos, devil, the deceiver, the liar, the slanderer, more literally. Okay, all of these terms fit. If the shoe fits, let's let him wear them. And Satan in Greek doesn't have the rule about the definite article. You can have ha, like ha Jesus. It's not the Jesus, it's just Jesus. Greek tolerates a definite article in front of a proper personal name. Hebrew does not, just like English. Languages are different. So by the time you get into the Greek-speaking world, which is in between the Testaments, the Hellenistic period, I hate to bring up history of Civ because you all wanted to forget that in high school as soon as you had it. But the Hellenistic era is a big deal. The world becomes Greek-speaking. And with that, the language has more elasticity. And so Satanas can become a proper personal name in a Greek-speaking world, and it does. And since the New Testament's written in Greek, they use that. This is all you have. You don't have a contradiction between the Testaments. You have a supernatural rebel in Genesis 3 that brings the ruination of Eden and death and estrangement from God, and over time he gets called lots of things. They're all appropriate. That's it. But again, if I was a religion teacher at a typical undergraduate institution, and I have a bunch of Christians in my Religion 101 class, I can't wait to talk about this. Because I'm going to, in 60 minutes, I'm going to have you thinking your Bible is ridiculous and full of contradictions. I'm going to give you textual dilemmas like this, and I'm not going to unpack them for you at all, because I want to destroy your faith. This is easy. It's easy. And don't get the impression that every professor of religion or biblical studies that isn't a Christian is like this. They're not. Most of them are apathetic toward issues of faith. I mean, they're not there to intentionally harm people, but there are some that are. They live for it, okay? I have met them. They're out there. And the solution to this, again, is to teach people, especially, high school and stuff like this, to get them ready for these kinds of things that they're going to have in their religion class. Because what a coincidence, they're forced to take this class. Oh, who would have thought that? Well, again, there's an agenda here. So I probably got a little far afield with that, but there is a role for that, and there is a logic as to why this one gets elevated, in terms of the understanding that you get in the New Testament, but it's not directly linked to the scene in Job 1 and 2.
My question's going to be a lot easier than that. You had mentioned translations that you use from the
Go ahead.
Dead Sea Scrolls.
Yeah.
Could you tell us some of those translations? Because I notice some of ours are a little bit different than what you have been putting up.
Yeah, I'll show you a few here, and you can write them down. I mean, it's instructive just to go through the list here. So this is Deuteronomy 32:8, and the key phrase here is according to the number of the sons of God. Pardon. So let's just look at New RSV. According to the number of the gods. So for sure, they're referencing a text that has Elohim there. And if you look at the footnote in the NRSV, it'll say Q, that's Qumran, that's the Dead Sea Scrolls, manuscripts, and then compare Greek and the Targums, and the MT is the traditional Hebrew text. The MT has the Israelites, and the Targums would follow the MT. Targums are Aramaic translations of the Hebrew Bible that were around in Jesus' day. So NRSV is tracking with the Dead Sea Scrolls. NLT is what came after the Living Bible. The Living Bible was a paraphrase, and this is less paraphrastic, but it still is interpretive. Look at what they do here. According to the number of his heavenly court. Now, for sure, they're thinking supernatural beings, but in an interlinear, you could, court, what's the word for court? Well, there's just a dot there. There's nothing. There is no corresponding Hebrew word for court or council here. It's an interpretive translation, but it's still tracking on the same idea. So NLT is going to be in this range. Let's see here. I think probably, let's see here. Yeah, New American Standard is going to be Israel for sure. Let's just go up there. That's that's 95. What's this one? Well, let's just go up to this one. Yeah, it's going to be according to the number of the sons of Israel. So the New American Standard is going to follow the traditional Hebrew text. It does not follow the Dead Sea Scrolls. Let's look at the NIV here, which this is the 1984 version. I'm sure, yeah, sons of Israel, so they're going to follow the traditional Hebrew text. It varies by translation, so there are a few, that incorporate the Dead Sea Scrolls in the translation in some way. So let's talk a little bit about translations. And I know you probably don't want to hear this because it's going to sound as boring as it probably is, unless you're kind of a translation geek. One of the best things you can do to any new translation you start using, or the one you're using now, is to read the preface. Dun, 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 dun. Yes, prefaces are boring. They're the things you skip and never look at. We all know that. But the preface will tell you what text they are following and whether they make exceptions to that or not. So if you read the preface to the ESV, they'll say something like, for the most part, we follow the traditional Masoretic text. But in places, we change that, we depart from that, and we defer to the Dead Sea Scrolls, where we think it matters. They'll just tell you. They'll also tell you what their translation philosophy is. And there are two basic translation philosophies. One is called formal equivalence. It's what we usually think of as literalism. Formal equivalence, if I'm on a committee, let's say I was asked to participate in creating a new English translation, and our instructions are, this is going to be a formal equivalent translation. I know, because I'm familiar with the field, that what they want is they want an English translation that attempts to have a corresponding English word for every word in the original Hebrew, Aramaic, or Greek. In other words, we try to have some English rendering for every word in the original source text. In some places that's not possible, but King James is very formally equivalent. New American Standard is very formally equivalent. And they're also going to tell you we're sticking to the Masoretic text. We're not going to depart from that. You just get these instructions. So formal equivalence is we try to strike word-for-word correspondence in English. The other approach is called dynamic equivalence. And this approach means that, look, we don't really care if you account for every word in Hebrew, Aramaic, or Greek. You don't need to come up with a corresponding English word for that. What we want you to do is look at your original language, figure out what's being said there, and then in whatever words you think are appropriate, put that into English. You can use whatever you want. So it's dynamic. There's some variability there. It's not as sort of rigidly, literalistic. So those are your two basic translation philosophies. And most translations, if they clearly land on one end or the other, they'll tell you in the preface. We are a formally equivalent translation. Other times they'll say, we tried to do, we tried to do a little mix of both, and we weren't like really married to one or the other. They'll just tell you. So it's a good idea to know what the approaches are and to read the preface of your Bible, because it'll tell you little things like this. For instance, it'll tell you, I don't know if it'll footnote this specifically. Let's just go to the New Testament. Let's see here. Did I type that correctly? I guess not. John 5:1. Okay. So this is the pool of Bethsaida. Read up to verse 5. Just do it right here and tell me what's odd. Should make it a little bigger. What's odd? Anybody? There's no verse 4. Did you see that? There's verse 1, there's verse 2, there's verse 3, and there's verse 5. What happened to verse 4? Oh, it's a sinister conspiracy. The deity of Christ is dependent on John 5:4, and they took it out. Please, no. Your preface would tell you. Your preface would tell you what family of Greek manuscripts they favor. So here the footnote is, some less important manuscripts have, and there's the remainder. It's part of verse 3 and on into verse 4. Okay? So what I really recommend, if you're interested in this sort of thing, is this resource. And it's free on the web. You don't have to have Logos Bible software. The Net Bible has a translation. I'll just show you what the translation looks like. There's the Net Bible translation. You'll notice it goes from verse 3 to verse 5, and then it has this note number 9. Okay, you can click on that, or you can, if I had these linked, you could go over here. Let's just get the bigger view. So, oops, sorry about that, number 9, not verse 9. Here it is. So at the end of verse 3, it has this note number 9, and it'll explain what manuscripts have what reading in them, and then it'll tell you why they made the decision they did. Now, for a lengthy discussion like this is not a footnote in a study Bible, but if you know a little bit about the differences between Greek manuscripts of the Greek New Testament and the families, they're grouped into families. And a family means these manuscripts agree together against other manuscripts that say something else, and vice versa. And they come from different time periods and different scribes and so on and so forth. It's actually not quite as complicated as that sounds, but they'll tell you, again, which text they were following. And that's why verse 4 is not in either of these translations. The King James will have it in, because the King James is making a different textual choice. But it was done in 1611, in the 17th century. In other words, 400 years before, mountains of Greek New Testament material has been found that is older than the stuff that they had to work with in 1611. The stuff they're using in 1611 is from the Middle Ages. Specifically, Erasmus' third edition of his Greek New Testament, which morphed through a couple printings by some other people, Stephanus and whatever, the Elsevier brothers and all these different editions. That was based on 6 Greek New Testament manuscripts, all of which were medieval. They had nothing to work with that is from the close centuries to the New Testament period. And it wasn't because Erasmus was lazy. They just didn't have it. And it's not like you can pick up the phone and say, hey, Bodleian Library, could you mail this manuscript over to me because I'm working on this translation for the king? No, they can't do that. Erasmus literally says, I'm going to use whatever is at a university or monastery within 50 miles because I got to go there on a horse. Okay? It's just a totally different world. They don't have a lot of material, and a lot of it hadn't even been discovered yet. So there's all sorts of sort of historical reasons, the vicissitudes of time and history as to why different translations are based on the manuscripts they are, which is why I always recommend use more than one. Because if you use more than one, your eye will catch differences like this, and then you'll know, okay, there's probably something important here because there's kind of a substantial disagreement. And from that point, you're really dependent on, do I know what a commentary is? Maybe I can find something on the internet, but I never recommend doing Bible study on the internet, just so we're clear. Okay. But that doesn't mean there's nothing good out there, because there is a lot of good stuff. But the thing is, you don't know if you land on the good stuff or the horrible stuff. So you should know what a commentary is and stuff like that, and it'll help you decide, or at least understand why we have big differences between translations. So anyway, we should do another question.
Hey, Dr. Heiser, longtime fan, first-time Q&A-er. Since we're talking about critical scholarship in the text, 1 Peter 3:19. You probably already know a lot more. You could probably finish my question for me, but it begins. It's in which he also preached to the minister to the spirits in prison. In the Greek, it's I'm bad with pronouncing Greek, but I think it's hein noi kai. And there's debates, I guess, going back 100 years about whether or not there's no manuscript that demonstrates this, but there's kind of like a ghost variant where... Say
that line again?
Well, I'm making up a term here, but there's a perceived... the original text may have said hein noik kai.
With head up?
Yeah, it could be, and that's exactly where you would find Enoch if Enoch was ministering to the spirits.
You're right. I wish that was there.
Yeah.
Because it would be kind of cool, but I don't know of any manuscript for that. And should we unpack as to why we're having this discussion, or you want to ask something more specific?
Well, I mean, obviously, it's a strange text.
Yeah.
You get a lot of expansive, almost like Mishnaic kind of ruminations over the centuries about the harrowing of hell in Christ. In 3 days, he's going to this one specific people group that happens to sound a lot like what Enoch does, but it could just be if you just miss one. I think it's a key. And in majuscule Greek, it looks a lot like a kappa. Or you hear it wrong. You could even
I know, and a lot of people forget or don't remember that.
Yeah.
Even as scholars, we tend to forget that a lot of copying of manuscripts was oral. In other words, you have one guy reading a text and another guy copying it as he reads it, and the guy copying it is not looking at the text. So in this case, what he's getting at is you could have two different letters. One is the K, the kappa, and the other one is a transliteration for het in Hebrew, which is a different letter. And they could sound the same. And the scribe puts one down when the other one should have been put down, and therefore you get a variant, either a mistake or we'll just call it a variant, in the manuscript. And then the next guy who copies this copy is going to perpetuate, that reading. So that does, all those things, they're possibilities. I'd love to have something
speculative.
because I'm there.
Yeah. Yeah.
In this case, what we're talking about here is, let me just see if I can illustrate this. Let's go to Jude. So we have here, let's see here. I'm looking for the seventh from Adam phrase here. I should just look it up. Let's just look it up here. It'll save us some time here. Actually, I should capitalize it. Oh, we can go. We can do ESV. It's not going to matter here. Don't change it for me. All passages. So I'm going to switch your view here. Sorry. Let's just go with this one. Jude 14. So Jude 14 mentions Enoch. All right. Now, if we look at Jude 14 over here, I'm going to open up this second copy of this. So we have Greek New Testament side by side. So in this one, I'm going to put in Jude 14. And look at the way Enoch is spelled. I'll make it enlarged here. So we have E, that's the Greek word for the letter for N, O, Enoch. We have a chi to get the k sound. So the question is, are there any manuscripts that say, look, here's the first three letters are the same, E, N, omega, and then a K? Now, in the original Greek manuscripts, the oldest ones, the uncials or the papyri, there were no spaces between words. There's no punctuation. There's also no accents. So he's wondering, could a manuscript have said E, N, O, and then chi or chi instead of kappa? And you say, well, who cares? What's the difference? Because if it is that, then you have Enoch in this verse, whereas here you don't. And let's just go back to the Net Bible here in 1 Peter 3. Instead of in the same, let's see, go down here. For who is going to harm you? Boy, I'm getting the numbering wrong here. Oh, in it, so here's the Net Bible note. In which, remember his question, he started out, in which also. That's the literal rendering here, in which also. So in which also he went and preached to the spirits in prison. Well, who's he? If you have Enoch in the verse, it would say, and Enoch went and preached to the spirits in prison. And if you're wondering, why are we even having this discussion? We need to talk about 1 Peter 3. So a lot of you already know this because you've read Unseen Realm. Okay, so let's get rid of all this. And I would love there to be an Enoch. That would just be awesome. And you'll find out here in a few minutes as to why. But here in 1 Peter 3, this is this weird passage. Let me just look at it. You have here, for Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirit. In which he went, or maybe it was Enoch, okay. He went and proclaimed to the spirits in prison, because they formerly did not obey when God's patience waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is 8 persons, were brought safely through water. Baptism, which corresponds to this, now saves you, not as a removal from dirt from the body, but as an appeal to God for a good conscience through the resurrection of Christ, who has gone into heaven, and is at the right hand of God with angels, authorities, and powers being subjected to him. It's as though Peter thought, you know what? In this paragraph, I'm going to take 5 different subjects and just throw them in the blender and hit the on button. And just throw everything in there, and whatever comes out, I'm good with that. Like, what do these things have to do with each other? Spirits in prison, Jesus, resurrection, Noah, ark, baptism. Like, what in the world is going on here? Now, you probably heard me tell this story. When my wife and I moved to Wisconsin, we were looking for churches. And we happened to run into one that was real close to the house. The guy's going through 1 Peter. A series, and it was good. I thought, man, this is it. This is the church. So we should look at some other ones. And so we went away for a few weeks. And we came back on the day that it was 1 Peter 3, 18 through the end here. And I thought, this is going to seal the deal right here. Because I like this passage. Because it's weird. Okay? If it's weird, I like it. And so the guy, it's the only time I've ever seen anybody do this in church. The guy gets up into the pulpit and says, well, according to the schedule, we're supposed to do 1 Peter 3, 18, through the end. And I got to be honest with you, the passage is so weird and so strange, I'm just going to skip it. And he did. He was serious. He skipped it. Like it's not even there. And I'm like, aren't you just going to try? Like, my wife didn't have to ask me, but we're not going back. It's like, I can't believe that he actually stood in the pulpit and said, I'm going to skip it because it's too weird. Okay, it is weird. But let me unpack it for you, and this is why we get the Enoch reference. Are you familiar with the term typology? Okay, a couple of you. We know, let me get into it this way. You know what a prophecy is? A prophecy is a verbal utterance, a verbal prediction of something that's going to come in the future. Okay, so prophecy is verbal. A type, this is not just an academic word, it's also in the New Testament. Like in Romans 5, you actually get the word tupos, a type of things to come. A type is a non-verbal foreshadowing of something to come in the future. So prophecy is verbal, a type is non-verbal, but they both foreshadow something to come. A type, therefore, can be lots of different things. It could be a person, like Moses was a foreshadowing of Jesus. Jesus is the prophet like unto Moses. The Passover lamb is a type, a foreshadowing of Christ's crucifixion. Christ is our Passover lamb. A type could be an institution, like Passover. It could be an event. It could be a person. It could be lots of different things in the Old Testament that happen that foreshadow something to come. Now, in Romans 5, Paul uses this term and this concept to refer to Adam. Adam is a type of Christ because there are things about Adam that parallel and foreshadow things about Jesus. It's simple. He goes through a few in Romans 5. Now, here's how to read 1 Peter 3. For Peter, Adam is not the type of Christ. He's not the foreshadowing. Enoch is. And you would know that if you know the story of Enoch, like, Peter, 1 Peter, 2 Peter 2:4, the angel that sinned, sent to Tartarus and all that. I mean, Peter is very familiar with Enoch and Enochian literature in the Second Temple, the intertestamental Jewish period. So here's why it makes sense. If you know the Enoch story, you know exactly what Peter's doing here and why. In the Enoch story, again, chapters 6 through 11, it's the story of Genesis 6 amplified in all sorts of ways, details. The story goes something like this. The Watchers, that's Enoch's term for the sons of God of Genesis 6, descend to earth. They make a pact among themselves to have children and corrupt humanity and blah, the whole thing again. So they descend to Mount Hermon and they hatch their plot. So after they do what they do, it sows chaos on the earth because of the Nephilim that are born, and they're cannibalistic, they kill people, it's just chaos. And so the archangels go to God and say, have you noticed what's going on down there? It's just bad. And God says, yeah, of course I've noticed. Why don't you guys, he appoints a few archangels, you go down there and you clean house. So they go down there and they destroy the Nephilim and they arrest, they imprison the Watchers. And they get assigned to the abyss, to the pit. Okay, that's their punishment. Well, while they're in the punishment in the pit, they're like, well, this sucks. Maybe we should repent and tell God we're sorry, and we don't want to stay here until the time of the end. What does that mean? So they said, well, who does God like that we could contact? And we're never told how, but who would God listen to on our behalf? Let's ask Enoch, because Enoch walks with God and he's favored. Let's ask Enoch to go to God and say, hey, the Watchers over there in the pit, they're sorry. And they repent, and they would like to be let out. So Enoch does that. He goes to God, and it's a real short conversation, as you can imagine. So Enoch, catch the wording, Enoch descends into the pit. He descends into the pit where the spirits are imprisoned. And he tells them what? No, you're doomed. God is not going to forgive you. You're going to be here until the end of days. This is your home. There's no repentance for you. This is the realm of the dead, and the dead do not escape, blah, 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 blah. Okay? And then he leaves. So it's bad news. So for Peter takes that story that he knows his readers are familiar with, And he says, this foreshadows things about Jesus. What does it foreshadow? Well, when Jesus dies, he descends. This is the Apostles' Creed. He descended into hell, which is a terrible translation of Hades. But anyway, he descends into the realm of the dead. And Peter is offering here now, while he's there, he does what Enoch did before. He tells the powers of darkness. Again, this is Mike's paraphrase here. Just what the conversation would have been like. Hey, fellas, I bet you're surprised to see me here. Son of God and everything, like here I am in the underworld, which means I'm dead. And you probably think that some of your buddies who are also rebels got even with God and killed me off, and God's plan for humanity is over. He lost because I'm dead. I just thought I'd tell you that your sentence is not going to be lightened at all. You're still going to be here until the end of days because God didn't lose, because I know something you guys don't. Yes, I'm here in the realm of the dead, but I'm not going to be here very long. See ya. You're still doomed. I am not, and neither is humanity, because I'm going to rise from the dead. So Peter applies this scene in Enoch to this, and if you go back and look at the passage, he connects it to Noah, the flood, the ark, the whole bit. Baptism corresponds to this, not in the sense of, I get baptized and that's why I'm forgiven. No, the key is the resurrection. Through the resurrection of Christ, an appeal to God for a good conscience. By the way, I go through all this in some detail in Unseen Realm. But the appeal, when we think of conscience, we think of the thing inside of us that arbitrates between right and wrong. The term synodesis has another meaning, and that means there's another meaning that basically talks about it being an oath of allegiance, a pledge of loyalty. And it's the same thing for the corresponding phrase here. Let's see here. Appeal for a good conscience through the resurrection of Christ. Again, this whole idea of an appeal and the conscience, combined, again, these terms, when you put them together, it's a loyalty oath. It's an oath of allegiance to Christ through the resurrection. And baptism corresponds to this, which is why baptism is essentially an act of spiritual warfare. This is why the early church, in their baptismal formulas, had some statement about the person being baptized. It has something to do with the defeat of the devil and his angels. There are very ancient baptismal formulas from the early church that linked baptism with the defeat of the devil and his angels. And this is the passage that they get that from. So that when I submit to baptism, I declare not only to the people watching, but I declare to the spirits, the spirit world, which side I am on. And if you're going with the Peter typology, along with that, it's a reminder that the Son of God was not beaten. We are doomed. He is not, and his children are not. So 1 Peter 3 is sort of transformed into baptism as spiritual warfare. And if you read it that way, with, again, this little scene in the book of Enoch about the watchers, and that is a type for Peter, it's a foreshadowing of Jesus, just like for Paul, Adam is the foreshadowing of Jesus. It makes perfect sense. And it's awesome. I mean, it's a great passage. It's just a punch in the face. This is why it ends with, he's gone into heaven, is at the right hand of God with angels, authorities, and powers having been subjected to him. Who's the winner now? It ain't you guys. So it's a great illustration. So he's wondering, are there any texts, manuscripts of the Greek New Testament, that actually explicitly say in verse 19, and Enoch went and proclaimed to the spirits? I wish there was. Because then it would be like point blank explicit. So, even though there's not, again, you had this tradition or this reading, again, just with the simple thing, well, maybe Peter's thinking typologically. Just like Paul does. I mean, types are found with some frequency in the Bible between the Testaments, things that foreshadow other things. So the question is, well, what if that's what's in Peter's head? Does the passage make any sense if Enoch is a foreshadowing of Jesus with all this flood watcher, sons of God stuff going on? Yeah, it does. It makes really good sense. And somebody in the early church read it that way. Because they have it right in the baptismal formulas. And it's really cool. It's cool stuff. Ooh, we're moving on to our fourth question here.
All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to do two last questions for time. So we're going to go here, and then I'll go right over here, okay?
Hey, Dr. Heiser. Mm-hmm. So in the 21st century Christians, we understand that the God of Israel is the unique ontological being. There's nothing equivalent like him. And looking back in sort of Jesus' time, it seemed as though the Jews of the era seemed to understand that the God of Israel was also, they believed in a plurality of Elohim, but that there was something ontologically distinct about the God of Israel. Do you have any sort of speculation or opinion when that belief arose? Do you believe it dates all the way back to the patriarchs, like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob may have understood that? Or did they start out perhaps believing that sort of they have a covenant to a specific member of the Elohim, and then gradually they came to understand that actually their Elohim was the Elohim?
I think it tends to be pretty early because of statements like in Genesis 14, where Yahweh is referred to as the maker of heaven and earth. And you can really only have one of those. Now, did Abraham, he has the conversation with Melchizedek, and this language, is part of the exchange and whatnot. So I think if Abraham, took the conversation seriously, then he is assigning, because this is the priest of the Most High God, and Abraham's not going to be paying tithes to him unless this is my God too. So I think he would have probably at least one sort of ontological peg on which to hang that idea, that this is the maker of all things. So I tend to think it does start pretty early. And then you get, an accrual of thoughts to it in different places in the Hebrew Bible. Then this takes you into all sorts of other questions about, well, how do we know, when Genesis 14 was written, and, was this really a conversation? Those are sort of broader, I don't want to use, I guess I'll use the word philosophical. These are sort of broad philosophical discussions, but they're also questions and discussions that extend from whether we are going to look at Scripture as being a coherent word that is faithful to reality. In other words, it relays things that actually happened, regardless of when they were written. And I do. I think that's a reasonable standard to hold. I tend, this is going to sound really goofy, but I tend to be a skeptic of modern historical critical methods because, or in that, they are never equally applied. Okay, I have a lecture, like when I'm head of a school of theology now that's an online school. And in the 201 class, we offer 2 years. This is the third class of 4. It's one class per semester. We spend a week on biblical historicity, where we talk about how the Bible is dismissed as a historical source because its writers must have been biased because they're all men. It's a patriarchal society. Nobody, the conversations that are there, we can't find in some other source. There's too much God talk, and we can't take that seriously because we can't prove that God's real, empirically. And there's all sorts of ways to try to undermine the historicity of something. So my test is, both for scholars and students, is, okay, if you're married, I want you to write the history right now for me of your wedding. Tell me your wedding day. Give me a record of that. If you're not, then just give me a little biography of you to the present moment. I'll give you half an hour, whatever it is. Or you could take it home, bring it back. Because the questions are always going to be the same. I'm going to get that piece of paper, and I'm going to look at it and say, this thing that happened at your wedding, is there an alternate source for that? Did anyone record the conversations? I see this is only from your perspective. Why don't you have your wife's voice in here? Why don't you have, did you make any effort to go around to all the people that attended your wedding to verify what I have here? I mean, I could pepper this thing endlessly, knowing that you don't record anything, because you're not an idiot, okay? You're not going to record this like, oh, someday I'm going to have to write all this down. I'm going to have to subject it to the tools of historiography, okay? You can write it down, and it can be completely true. Everything in there can conform to reality, but it will pass none of the tests that professional historians insist we must go by, really, when it comes to the Bible. Not so much when it comes to other sources, but definitely for the Bible. The God talk. Oh, you mean like Ramses, the second's battle at Kadesh, when basically he commits a blunder and is about to die, and then he invokes, the sun god, and then all of a sudden the battle turns and he gives credit to his God. Why is it that Egyptologists take that as a historical source? Everybody does. There are whole books written on the invocation of divine beings in ancient Near Eastern historical texts. Oh, their history. Oh, we don't like their gods. We think that's silly, but we're going to regard it as a historical source. Well, then why don't you do that to the Bible? Well, we don't want to do that. Well, why? Why won't you apply your same methods to your own life? The reality is you can't, Mr. Historian, you can't write your own life story and have it conform to your own methods. That's the truth. You can't do it. And so my question is, why are you marrying so much of what you say you will believe conforms to reality on these methods that you yourself will fail? Why? I know why. Because the implications of this stuff being true are just too disturbing. They're too offensive. That's why. You know, again, I'm trained in all these things, and I respect what scholars do because I benefit from their work. But when it comes to these presuppositions that scholars have and apply them unequally, okay, I'm the guy raising my hand in the room saying, you know, you're really not being consistent. And then I can flunk the class and get kicked out, okay? But I'm right. Okay, you are not doing this consistently. And I want to know why. You know, so again, I really do, I'm a beneficiary of lots of scholarship, and I pay close attention to it. But I have sort of assumption and presupposition radar in my head that goes off a lot. And the thing that I can do is I can be honest with you about my presuppositions, and all I'm asking you is to be honest about yours. And we can agree where they work and where they don't work, and just go on from there. But don't pretend to me that you're the academic, you're the scholar, and there are no other conclusions to draw here other than the ones that are floating around in your head, because you don't live by them. And I know it. So, you know, I don't have any trouble thinking that the Bible, okay, Melchizedek didn't have a tape recorder under his arm. He wasn't wearing a wire, okay? We get it. But is there any reason to think that this is not a faithful representation of a conversation that happened? No. What would that reason be? That there isn't a God? Well, good, you know, people have been doubting that for a few millennium. You're a little bit behind there, but I mean, you know, if that's what you think has been proven, gosh, you're naive, okay? But I mean, what is it? Why do we take these things at face value when they're in other civilizations, other conversations that appear in one text? Why? Why is it good over here and not good over there? I think it's very inconsistent. So I'm willing to say, yeah, I don't have any trouble believing that this conversation happened.
So say you're a pastor and you feel like it's important to begin to teach your congregation about the divine counsel and how that kind of fits in. Where do you start and how do you track from there?
You start by looking for the exits. No, I get this question a lot. So what we decided to do on the podcast was if you go to, I'll show you one just so that you know what they look like. We're in Firefox here. Okay. nakedbiblepodcast.com. If you go up to episodes right here, now you could Control F and search for the word conversations, but we'll just scroll down here till we hit one. Let's see, it's been a while. Conversation series. I asked pastors who subscribe to my newsletter, if you have tried to teach this content in your church, it could be pastors, it could be a youth pastor, it could be a Sunday school teacher, I don't really care who you are, but if you've tried to do this in some official capacity in your church, I asked them to email me. And I said, what I want to do is I want to have a podcast episode with you so that you can tell other people that are thinking about this, other pastors and teachers and whatnot, give them the good, bad, and the ugly. What worked, what didn't work, what went wrong, what went right. We'll just sit here on the podcast and have a conversation. So we did 5 of these. And they each have 4 guests. So we had 20 respondents. We had more than 20, but I picked 20. And I recommend you listen to those because some of them, they all have wise things to say. There are certain patterns that emerge, and some of them really had really good ideas that I would never have thought of. If I took those off the board, my own advice is don't turn the fire hose on to people. That's a big mistake because people are going to be overwhelmed and they're going to be frightened. My advice is to find something in the content that attaches itself very easily to something they already hold dear and believe. Like the 2 powers thing last night. That's very faith affirming. We connect the Trinity or the deity of Christ to the Old Testament. It's something they already believe, they hold as doctrine, and you get a little bit of ammunition from the first 3 quarters of your Bible for the idea. Because there are people out there on the internet, like a Bart Ehrman or whatever, saying, oh, this, the the disciples, the Jews, right there when Jesus was alive, doing his thing. Nobody ever thought of him as God or anything like this. That stuff was added later, hundreds of years later, by scribes. That's where high Christology comes from. It's an invention of the church. If you brought Matthew or John, back and you asked them, was Jesus God? They would look at you like you got two screws loose or something. And this is how they argue this. This is why, again, the grocery store impulse shelf. Every Easter and Christmas, you're going to see it. They're going to have magazines where you check out, and it'll say something like, the Christ of history versus the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith. Like they're two different characters. There's a historical Jesus, and then there's this one that religion made up. Never the twain shall meet. This is how it's presented, this bifurcation between the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith. And, it's just not true. It's just not true. The whole idea of God coming as a man is in the Old Testament. Not only that, it's in the Second Temple period. I don't know, Bart Ehrman has had to read Enoch. Enoch has a pre-existent Messiah. Enoch chapters 37 through 71. Uses all the Old Testament messianic terminology, but Enoch's Messiah, and he's Jewish. The guy whoever wrote the book of Enoch was a Jew, living before the New Testament. He's got a pre-existent Messiah. Well, to be pre-existent means you have to be more than human. So I would say, look, you find something that attaches itself to something important, and then start accruing some of this content to those important things. You can also, use some of the content where it solves a problem, or it helps explicate a passage in an interesting or powerful way. Because what you want people is, you want people to not artificially feel safe, but you want them to know that, there's a lot of things to think about here that you aren't normally introduced to. And there's a lot to think about in the Bible, and look at this, and look at that, and look at this. And you get 5 or 6 lessons into this, and then you can start introducing some of the things that would be unfamiliar to them, but then connect it back to the stuff you already did. Like, again, this is a matrix of ideas. All these things relate together. They produce doctrine for us. It's consistent across the Testaments. You try to do faith-affirming, faith-building sorts of things with the material from the text that would be unfamiliar. But you start with the familiar, or something that would be perceived as useful. But I would recommend listening to the series, because some of them had really specific ideas that I told them in the conversation. Boy, I wish I'd have thought of that. Because I did the same thing. I didn't get to speak in church much, in grad school and afterwards. But I can remember certain things that I probably should have done differently. But I didn't. I could just do it and leave and have the pastor clean up the mess. I just. And I tried not to do that, but if you have your head in it for so long, then nothing really feels unsafe anymore, and you forget that you had to grow, to this point, to understand something and how to talk about something. When you're just trying to do that for the first time, you don't often remember that. So I think that would be a good place to get some suggestions.
All right. Well, that's going to conclude our question and answer time. And thank you guys all again for joining us, and Dr. Heiser and Drina for coming down with him.
Thank you.
I know Dr. Heiser has already mentioned this, but he has the Unseen Realm and a lot of his different books back there. If you would like kind of the Unseen Realm for dummies, there's the Supernatural. No, I kid, but it's just more of a simpler way of...
I'll say this. There is a certain logic to some of the books, and that is, what does God want exists because I had a layperson say, we need a book for evangelism and discipleship that has some of your content in it. So it's like, okay, let's do that. And so that's for new believers or seekers. And I seed certain things in the book to prepare them for Supernatural, which is the light version of Unseen Realm. So there's this stair-step approach. What people know less about is the series, the Brief Insight series on the table there that Zondervan republished. I originally self-published those because I wanted to be able to sort of control the content. But eventually, Zondervan asked if they could republish those, and I said, okay. All of those things, every chapter in those books is no more than 600 words long. They're very short little lessons. Each book has 80 of them in it. And in those books, you will find divine counsel stuff. It's not all that. It's probably a quarter of any the content of any of the books. But I try to produce a lot of things for somebody just starting out in Bible study. Like, I Dare You Not to Bore with the Bible. Those are all articles from Bible Study Magazine. They're all 600 words or less. So something that you can hand somebody who doesn't have a whole lot of Bible study experience under their belt. It's easy reading, but it helps people learn something and then get set up to go to the next step. So that series, the Brief Insight series and Supernatural, those are good things to hand people to start off. And if they're a new believer, I would even go with What Does God Want? It has over 500 reviews on Amazon. A lot of them are from people who've been Christians for a long time. And they like it. I didn't expect that because that wasn't the intended audience. But it's a good book to just sort of start people out on.
So make sure you guys check out the content on the back, and then also Naked Bible Podcast.
Yeah, that's the deeper dive. That's
Yes.
People are into podcasts today, so by all means.
So let's give it up for Dr. Michael Heiser once again.